Started.
Hello, good morning, dear students, once again. Now, this is the third video, that is Kubla Khan part third. In this video, I'll try to dictate the theme, give you an overview of the poem, and give you also the introduction of the poem. Introduction to the poem, rather. So, please note down the theme quickly. The poem deals with the theme of poetic creativity, full stop. Coleridge suggests that a poet succeeds in rising above the mundane, mundane, the mundane existence, and becomes acquainted with the undivided life when he is able to realize the fusion of pleasure and sacredness. Full stop. Such a poet achieves divine inspiration which becomes a source of poetic creativity, full stop. Once caught, CAUGHT, in a spell of poetic creation, comma, the poet undergoes an intense and overpowering experience of ecstasy, ECSTACY, which, now within brackets, in the poem, brackets closed, is likened to paradisaic, that's Paradisiac, paradisaic pleasure, full stop. As a result, the poet becomes a blessed being, a blessed being or a superhuman who is gifted with the ability of creating genuine and powerful poetry. Powerful poetry. Full stop. Uh, right, so this is the theme. Now, please understand the basics of the poem, the basic aspects of the poem. देखिए, इसमें मंडेन का माने होता है अर्थली, सांसारिक जिसे बोलते हैं दुनियावी। तो लाइफ को उमूमन हम दो एस्पेक्ट्स में देख सकते हैं, that is pleasure and sacredness. Usually, sacredness is believed to be in contrast with pleasure. You see, for example, religion puts many restrictions on us. There are moral restrictions. There are certain things which we are not allowed to do. For us, they may be things of pleasure. So, for instance, in certain religion, a thing like watching movie or music is prohibited. It is considered to be unsacred, and people believe that it is a thing of pleasure. तो इस तरह से प्लेजर और सेक्रेडनेस में कंट्रास्ट है। लेकिन क्या होता है कि वो पोएट जो I'll refer to the theme. You see, according to the poet, a poet really achieves or kind of achieves success in rising above his earthly existence when he is able to realize or experience this fusion of sacredness and pleasure. यानी जब उसे ऐसा महसूस हो जाता है, उस लेवल पे आ जाता है जहाँ उसे सेक्रेडनेस में प्लेजर मिलने लगता है, और प्लेजर भी उसे वही प्लेजर लगता है जिसमें सेक्रेडनेस हो। जब ये स्टेज आ जाती है पोइट की, तो ही बिकम्स डिवाइनली इंस्पायर्ड, और उसे एक एक्सटेसी का इंटेंस और ओवरपावरिंग एक्सपीरियंस होता है। जैसे कि आपने पिछले साल पढ़ा होगा, in case of Keats, when he is with Nightingale in his imagination, he experiences ecstasy, extreme joy. उसको ऐसा एक्सपीरियंस होता है जैसे पैराडाइज का एक्सपीरियंस है, हेवनली जॉय का. तो this poet also has a similar experience, and he becomes gifted. In fact, he becomes a blessed being, a superhuman, and he is gifted with the ability of creating great poetry. तो उसमें ऐसी पावर्स आ जाती हैं कि वो ग्रेट पोइट्री क्रिएट करता है. Now, actually, there are various theories of poetic creation. For some, poetry is an imitation, or literature is an imitation. For Wordsworth, nature was the source of inspiration. For Coleridge, the inspiration is divine. It comes from the Creator, from the God. और ये इंस्पिरेशन आती ही तब है जब इंसान फिलोसॉफिकली या साइकोलॉजिकली या स्पिरिचुअली उस लेवल पे पहुंच जाए जबकि उसे सेक्रेटनेस और प्लेजर में कोई फ़र्क महसूस ना हो. जैसे मैंने पहले कहा, सेक्रेटनेस में भी प्लेजर लगे और प्लेजर में भी सेक्रेटनेस लगे. अच्छा, now how this theme is established. You see, the poem is divided in two parts. Part 1 describes a landscape. This landscape has a pleasure dome, that is a majestic, splendid palace, and which is situated on the banks of the river called Alf. And there are gardens, bright spots, sinuous rills, forests, and hills. There is a deep romantic chasm, a deep broad cut in the earth. एक दर्रा है, एक वैली है. तो उसकी डिटेल में हम बाद में जाएंगे जब पोएम पढ़ेंगे. वहाँ से, from that chasm, a fountain is created. वो मिस्ट्री है उसमें, कैसे क्रिएट हुआ पता नहीं, लेकिन एक फाउंटेन जो है वो क्रिएट हो गया. उसी के वाटर से ये रिवर फ्लो कर रही है. नाउ इंटरेस्टिंगली, दिस रिवर फ्लोज 5 miles underground and 5 miles on the plains and the gardens and other parts of the landscape, and then falls into the caves, underground caves, and finally it descends into a sunless sea. So the pleasure dome is in the center of the palace landscape. To one side one side of the palace are the caves. To the other side of the palace is the fountain, the source of the river. Now, the river symbolizes sacredness, and the palace symbolizes pleasure. And the point where the two, that is the river and the palace, meet, that point is symbolic of the conjunction or the fusion of sacredness and pleasure. So this whole landscape stands for what? For a conjunction or fusion of sacredness and pleasure. Now, in the second part, the poet refers to a vision in which he saw a damsel, a beautiful girl, playing on her dulcimer and singing of the beauty or the glory of Mount Abora. Now, he says that if he can recreate that music, then he would feel inspired, and he would produce great poetry, give graphic description. He would be divinely inspired. and he would experience heavenly pleasure in poetic creation. उसको heavenly paradisiac pleasure होगा poetic creation में, and his poetry will have uh, supernatural powers. Now, please remember one thing, that in poetry, this analogy is very common. That is symbolizing architecture to poetry or music to architecture. So, इसमें पोइट्री में ये इस्तेमाल होता रहा है. आर्किटेक्चरल जो एस्पेक्ट्स हैं, कोई ब्यूटीफुल बिल्डिंग है, जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल ताज, तो इसको अमूमन पोइट्स ने एज अ सिंबल यूज़ किया है. और यहाँ पे जो लैंडस्केप सिंबलाइज करता है फ्यूजन ऑफ सेक्रेडनेस एंड प्लेजर, तो जो सेकंड पार्ट में वो म्यूज़िक है, वो म्यूज़िक भी सेक्रेडनेस और प्लेजर को ही सिंबलाइज करता है, इसके फ्यूजन को. तो वंस द पोइट एक्सपीरियंसेस दैट फ्यूजन, he feels inspired. In this sense, the two parts are connected. ठीक है. Now, you see in the poem, some details are fictitious. Some details hint at reality. For example, Alf, as I told you in the meanings, is the name of a fictitious river. Abora is a mountain, and it's again an imaginary mountain. Then there are hints to real things. Kubla Khan, for example, was a historical figure, a real person in history. And Xanadu used to be a real city. It may have some other names, different names spelled differently, but there used to be a city like that. So then throughout the poem, the poet mixes uh, subconscious images which are unbelievable, and then there are realistic images. वो डिटेल्स आएंगी जब हम पोएम पढ़ेंगे. अभी तो आप सिर्फ इतना समझ लीजिए कि रियल और इमेजिनरी को मिक्स किया गया है. नाउ दिस एलिमेंट इज कॉल्ड सररियलिज्म. So I think first what we should do is that we should read all about the poem and Coleridge given in the book. So let's see. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, his dates are given here, 1772 to 1834. Now, S.T. Coleridge was imaginative even as a child. He studied at Cambridge. In 1797, he met Wordsworth. The two belonged to the first generation of the Romantic poets. Now, Coleridge was responsible for presenting the supernatural as real, and Wordsworth would try to render ordinary reality as remarkable and strange. Yes, Coleridge's poetry, is full of supernatural element. In fact, he presents supernatural as natural, and Wordsworth presents natural as supernatural. So that too is quite evident in the poem. Byron, Shelley, and Keats belong to the next generation of Romantic poets. Now, the genesis of this poem was a vision that is the creation, the source of creation was a vision seen by Coleridge in a trance-like state of mind. Trance, a state of insensibility कह सकते हैं, लेकिन जैसे कि लोग वज्द में आ जाते हैं, वज्द इसके लिए लफ्ज़ इस्तेमाल होता है। मसलन सूफिया जो थे, औलिया जो थे, सूफिया, वो जब वज्द में आ जाते थे कव्वाली सुनते सुनते, तो उन्हें होश नहीं रहता था कि वो क्या है, पता नहीं कहाँ हैं, क्या कर रहे हैं. So that sort of condition is called trance, which is subconscious or almost a state of insensibility. Now, he tried to capture its essence, but an interruption caused an irreparable break in his poetic flow. थोड़ी सी information और दी है इन्होंने. Let's read that as well. You see, Kubla Khan founded the Mongol dynasty in China in the 13th century. Then you will notice that this poem is incomplete. इसके बारे में हम बात करेंगे. There is a reason for this. In 1797, when Coleridge fell ill, some medicine was prescribed, from the effects of which he fell asleep in his chair while reading about Kubla Khan. In the 3 hours of profound sleep, he had a wonderful dream. On awakening, he distinctly recollected it and began to write it down, when he was interrupted by a chance visitor. The poem thus remained incomplete. So you see, that's what they tell us. We will talk more about it. Some of its aspects are, as I said, that Coleridge mixes real and unreal. Then there are images. The poem is very sensuous in nature. There are contrasting images which are put together throughout the poem. We'll focus on that. For example, images that strike the eye and images that strike the ear, both negative and positive, and the words used to describe the movement of water. Then, there are certain lines in the poem which refer to magical elements. You remember that magical elements are a characteristic of, romances written in the Middle Ages. And I told you once that romantic poetry has the influence of Middle Ages. Then we'll see what is the similarity between the poetic ecstasy and paradisaic pleasure. As I said, in poetic creation, the poet gets heavenly joy. Now, the poem is a fragment. We'll try to see what is it that has made it a lasting piece, lasting literary piece, or a great poem. Now, you see, just a minute. One more piece of information before I come to the introduction. There was a great Italian poet called Dante. He composed a poem called Divine Comedy, and it has 3 parts. We have Purgatorio. In fact, this poem is based on afterlife, the life after death. So Dante depicts the purgatory. According to the Christians, a certain sect of Christians believe that on the day of judgment there would be people who would first be purged of their sins and then sent to heaven. पहले उन्हें पर्गेटरी में भेजा जाएगा, चाहे आप उसे हेल कह लें या हेल से डिफरेंट है, लेकिन पर्गेटरी की स्पेशलिटी ये होगी कि इंसान के अंदर जो ईवल डिज़ायर है वो ख़त्म हो जाएगी और गुनाहों से वो धुल जाएगा, तब उसे जन्नत में भेजा जाएगा, अकॉर्डिंग टू क्रिश्चियन बिलीफ. सो पार्ट 1 इज कॉल्ड पर्गेटरी. Part 2 is called Paradiso, which depicts heaven. And Part 3 is Inferno, which is called Hell. Now, Coleridge composed 3 poems. You see Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, which you may have read earlier, Kubla Khan and Christabel. Now, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner is compared to Purgatorio. And Kubla Khan is compared to Paradiso. And Christabel is compared to Inferno. So, in Kubla Khan, we have a depiction of something like a paradise in part 1, you know. And part 2 shows how that paradise can be achieved or experienced, or what are the effects of experiencing that paradise in this world as far as poetry is concerned. So the poem shows Coleridge's theory of poetic creativity, and there are other aspects. Let us now move to introduction to the poem. You see, Kubla Khan was published at the request of Byron, Lord Byron, in 1816. And Byron described it as a vision in a dream, a fragment. It was introduced with a brief preface explaining the circumstances in which it was composed. Now, according to Coleridge, Kubla Khan is now no more than a psychological curiosity. However, that is the view of the poet, but we are, of course, concerned with the poet, but not so much. We are more concerned with the poem. So we'll see what the poem actually is. Just because the poet calls it psychological curiosity, we, don't limit it to that aspect, though of course it is a hint to understanding poetry. Now there is a critic called Humphrey House, Humphrey, Humphrey House. He says that if Coleridge had not told us that the poem is a fragment, that the poem is incomplete, it would not have occurred to anyone that it is incomplete. And he believes that the poem is a complete one, dealing with the theme of poetic creativity. Then there is another critic called Wilson Knight, Wilson Knight, Wilson Knight. He regards the poem as a poem about life. So, these are two very established trends on this poem. Now, the prestige of this poem rose in the 19th century when pre-Raphaelites became popular, that is, art for art's sake. In the introduction to poetry, I have referred to pre-Raphaelites. खैर इसकी कोई ज़्यादा अहमियत नहीं है. इसको आप ऐसे समझ लें कि 19th century के सेकेंड हाफ में ये पोएम खासी पॉपुलर रही. एंड इन द 20th century, because there has been, in the early 20th century, there has been an emphasis on the unconscious and the value of dreams. So various critics or trends and attitudes have regarded this poem, that is Kubla Khan, as an early example of surrealism. So this is how this poem is seen. And just a minute. Well, you see, we'll have a look at the interpretation. Before we start the poem, we'll have a brief look at the interpretation given by Humphrey House. Because at your level, I mean, you can study the poem from the point of view of Elsie Knight also, or sorry, Wilson Knight. Um, but then this one will cover everything, the questions at the end and all approaches. Of course, we don't limit it to Humphrey House interpretation, but मतलब कि कोई ज़रूरी नहीं है कि ये इंटरप्रिटेशन हम फाइनल मान लें, लेकिन आपके लेवल को जहन में रखते हुए, इसको क्वेश्चंस को जहन में रखते हुए हम यही वाला इंटरप्रिटेशन पढ़ेंगे. So, according to Humphrey House, this poem is about an act of poetic creation, about ecstasy in imaginative fulfillment. And he tells us that there is a precision and clarity, especially in the first part, in the order of the landscape. Look, in the center there is the pleasure dome with its gardens on the river bank. For some reason I'll have to stop here.
Stop button.